Okay, I think it is registering now. So now I will divide the screen. Where is it? Here it is. So do you see the screen with my PDF file?
Yes, we can
Okay.
see it.
So as I promised, after the so-called epistemological analysis of the relevance of Galois' work, I like to call that the algebraic revolution in opposition, or if you like, in similarity to Copernican revolution and other revolutions in science that have taken place over the centuries. Now, it is important to have some idea of the conditions of life, the misfortunes and the environment where Évariste Galois was living his very, very short life. He died at the age of 21. Galois family was a family deep-rooted in the revolution, in the French Revolution. They were all mother and father were both liberals, so to say, or they were Republicans. And Galois' mother was also a believer, but while father was not, in the typical setup of the French Revolution. He was a rationalist, but he was a very honest and very straight person who, after the revolution, in the time of the Restoration, so it was destiny of Galois to live in the time of the Restoration after Napoleon's fall and the coming back of the royal family and the restoration of the monarchy, which was in a way was mimicking constitutional monarchy. That has to be said, but really was once again authoritarian as the ancient regime had been. So that was the time when he lived his youth. And Galois' father, notwithstanding his political opinions, which that were quite on the left for the times, and quite, so to say, nostalgic of the Republican and imperial times, nevertheless, he was mayor of his small village, small city around Paris, and he was well received by his fellow citizens because he was honest and tolerant administrator, and he was beloved by his son. The son got a very good education from his own parents, who were both very much well educated. In particular, mother was descendant of one of these famous families of jurists. You know that in the ancient regime, the ancien regime, a new type of nobility had developed in opposition to the older and greater feudal nobility, whose origin date back to Middle Ages. a new nobility, by quote unquote, developed that was made by members of what was called parliament at the time. The parliament was not the parliament in modern sense. Parliament was the set of tribunals, of juridical institution of the country. And these judges, lawyers, and server of justice in France um, um, became a sort of alternative nobility, not of spade, not of the sword, but nobility of the pen. Um, and Galois' mother, who survived him many, many years, she was daughter to a famous lawyer and famous member of the juridical school of Paris. And his ancestors also on that side were all judges and jurists. So he had an excellent education in Latin and in humanities, both from father and mother, and he was sent to school. But he was very unlucky in the school. The point is that very soon, at the age of 15 or so, he developed his great taste for mathematics. And he was not understood. He was a sort of misunderstood young talent. He was sent to a famous institution, a lyceum that still exists in Paris. It is le lycée Louis le Grand, which is located nowadays right in front of the École Normale Supérieure. It was a very good institution with very good teachers, but this teacher did not understand at all the young Galois, with the exception of one among them, who was the teacher of mathematics, who was later teacher also of other important mathematicians, because other important mathematicians had education in the same Louis le Grand Lyceum. So what happened is that he was at some point considered even as an idiot by his teachers. And that, of course, was a sort of pain for him in the back, because he clearly understood his own talents. And so he went on studying mathematics by himself. What he did, with the only encouragement of this teacher of mathematics, that instead understood his great talents. He studied everything that he could study in mathematics much early in life. He read books by Laplace, Legendre, even by Gauss. He was able to procure for himself books and articles of written by Gauss, and he was years ahead of his own fellow students and even of his teachers in his study of mathematics. That was really his main passion. So very early in his life, at the age of about 17, he conceived the idea that he wanted to become a student at the École Polytechnique. That was his great, and that was for two reasons. One reason was scientific, because of course he was interested in mathematics and pure science. But the second was political, because at the time, the École Polytechnique was the center of the silent and not too silent opposition to the restored monarchical government. All students of École Polytechnique were clearly, by quote unquote, revolutionary young people who would like to restore the Republic in principle. So he was really dreaming of becoming a polytechnician. That was his dream. And for this reason, he prepared himself for the examinations. At that time, like in present time, the examination for so-called les grandes écoles in France are very tough and very selective. And students who want to become polytechnician or normalien, or go to this very famous school ENA, École Normale d'Administration, which is the education center for all those who later become ministers, chief officers of ministry, and so on. They all have origin in ENA. They usually go to special middle schools whose main purpose is to prepare them for the exam, entrance exam to one of these three famous schools. It must be said that École Normale at the time did no longer exist. It was founded by Napoleon, like École Polytechnique, but at a certain point it was closed after the restoration, just because it was too much Napoleonic, so to say. It was too much a remnant of the revolutionary period. But École Polytechnique instead survived, and up to the present time, as you might know, the École Polytechnique is a military school in practice. It was created by Napoleon as the center for the education of the engineers and of all specializations, with the idea that they would be the main technical class of the Republic first and of the Empire later. And up to the present day, even if in practice the École Polytechnique is a normal institution, educational institute, is a normal university, but there are some moments when the cadets, so-called the students of École Polytechnique may be on 14 of or some occasion like that, dress in uniform, just to remind themselves that they are actually in a military school. Galois prepared himself for these examinations, and he tried it a very early time of his life, but he was rebuked. In fact, he was rebuked by someone who was a rather stupid examiner who did not understand even what Galois was saying. They were not expecting such a genius to appear at such an early age in front of them. That was a major blow for him. But nevertheless, he tried to prepare himself to repeat the exam the second time next year. Intervene in the meantime the famous glorious revolution of the 3 days when the population of Paris went to the streets and tried to rebel against the monarchy of at that time it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was already Louis the 18th had already resigned in favor of his own brother. But in any case, there was still a king of the ancient dynasty of the Capetingi. And population rebelled. There were so-called les Trois Glorieuses, this revolution of the 3 days, the end of which was that a person also from the royal family, the Duke of Orleans, Philippe, so-called Philippe l'Égalité. He had been, during the French Revolution, a sider of the revolutionaries. And in that occasion, it was finally summoned up by the winning revolutionaries, who divide themselves into factions. One of extreme Republicans who wanted to restore the Republic, the other more representing the middle classes, were favoring a compromise solution that was putting on the throne Philippe d'Orléans, Louis Philippe, but as a really constitutional king who adopted the flag with 3 colors, the flag of the Republic, called himself not Roi de France, but Roi de Français, Re dei Francesi, the king of the French people, and was, complying with all the constitutional requests of respecting a parliament. New elections were called, Senate was introduced, and etc., etc., etc. Now, during these 3 Glorieuses, of course, the dream of Évariste Galois was that of doing the same that is admired but unknown fellow students of the École Polytechnique had done. The students of École Polytechnique during the glorious French Revolution of the end of July of 1830 were on the barricades and were active part of the popular movement that overthrew the monarchy. But he did not succeed in that, because the very cautious and how to say, really not really thinking. Director of their lycée, Louis Legrand, managed to close all the doors of the lycée, and he forbade all of his students who were residing students. They were living in the precincts of the school, like internal students. He managed to block their exit to the street, and no one of them succeeded in exiting in the street and being part of the revolutionary movement. Of course, as soon as the new monarchy, constitutional monarchy of the Orleanists was established, the chief of Louis le Grand, in line with his character, immediately declared obedience, and he pretended of being a true Orleanist and things like that. All that was really revolting for Gallois, who was instead an idealist. At the same time, Gallois suffered another blow from fortune with the death of his father. There was, of course, at the time a very violent, at some point, in any case, very tense struggle between the right-wing supporter of the church and of the values of the old monarchy, and the free thinkers and liberals like his father was. So his father fell into a trap organized by il parroco, the parish leader of the small city where he was mayor. This guy organized something fake. He wrote a poem with very insulting words, for the time something not accepted by morals, and he pretended and convinced, he published it, or in some way made it publicly known, and pretended that that was written, this infamating poem was written by the mayor, by Gallois' father. So Gallois, the senior, found himself in a very ugly position, informated by the clergy, and not believed by many of his city fellows, and full of shame, Gallois' father fled to Paris, where he went to a low-cost hotel, and there he committed suicide. Then Gallois, who was very affectionate son, respecting his father, not only as a father, but also as a man, as an example of Republican virtues, was really depressed. And he had even the misfortune during the funerals of his father to witness a real battle between Republicans, participants to the funeral, and clergy supporter who came to hands and were literally making a fight in front of the coffin where his was his father's body was closed. So that was really a very bad time for Galois. But nevertheless, in this troubled times, Galois had started working on what was to become his major contribution to mathematics, the theorem about the resolution of algebraic equations based on group theory. So eventually he wrote a manuscript and wanted to get it published. And also there he was for 2 times really, how to say, blown by misfortune, because he gave his manuscript to he managed to reach such a well-known and absolutely first-class mathematician like Augustin Cauchy, and he gave his manuscript directly to him to consider for publication on the reviews published by the Academy of Science. But you know what happened? Apart from the fact that Cauchy was a well-known subscriber of the Ancien regime, and actually after the time when Louis Philippe was established as king, Cauchy refused to pledge his fidelity as a professor at the École Polytechnique to the new king and the new government. And because of that, he went away from France as an voluntary exile and came by invitation of King Carlo Alberto, to Torino, where he was for 3 years professor of our university. Then he fled to Prague, where he stayed with the exiled court of the overthrown king. But apart from that, and probably even ignoring Galois' sympathies for revolution, he managed to lose Galois' manuscript. And at that time, manuscript was 1 copy thing, because no computer, no copy machines, etc., etc. So Galois, at this point, tried 2 things. He tried to write once again all of his manuscript, containing eventually his really revolutionary theory. Think that he was about 19 of age at that point. And also he prepared himself to try for the second time the entrance examinations at the École Normale. Sorry, the École Polytechnique. École Normale, as I told you, had been suppressed and was reopened only 1 or 2 years later. And once again, for the second time, he was asked questions for which he knew the answer, and he was even writing the solution of the answer, that was something about mathematics, on the board, when the examiner told him that that was wrong. And in fact, who was wrong was the examiner. Galois was absolutely right. This is reported clearly by witnesses of all what happened. And he was taken by rage, Galois. He was rather, emotional person. And he took the small device to cancel the board, and something that is not hurting anyone, but the jest was something really improper, and he threw it in the direction of his examiner. So he was not only rebuked at the examination, but he was also alerted not to come back to École Polytechnique for any reason, considering his behavior. That was a major, major disaster from the point of view of Galois, because he considered École Polytechnique really a life dream. And after 2 times, in any case, you cannot repeat the examination a 3rd time. So he had this manuscript, no more expectations to become alumnus of École Polytechnique. But nevertheless, he tried for the 2nd time to publish his paper. And this time he went directly to the General Secretary of the Academy of Sciences of Paris, the Paris Academy of Sciences, one of the most famous academy in the world of that time, but also of our times. And he gave his manuscript in the hands of the Secretary General. Secretary General is a very important was a very important figure at the time. The guy was very kind with them and told him that he would consider the paper, and asked some expert from the academy to consider it, and promised to go through the procedure of revising the paper, and if suitable for publication, to publish it. But Galois' life was signed with all negative factors. And the problem this was really astonishing misfortune, both for the person who suffered the death and for Galois. The General Secretary of the Academy of Science went home this night, and suddenly he died by a stroke. So Galois was brokenhearted. And in any case, even in such circumstances, he addressed the family of the died scientist, asking if they could find his manuscript at home. But no one was able to find it. No one knows what happened. So for the 2nd time, his manuscript was lost. Then Galois engaged in political debates. He was, of course, on the side of the Republicans, and apparently during a dinner in some kind of popular restaurant with other friends, also on his political side, but some of them were also on the other side. He made some improper toast, sort of ironic toast, to King Louis Philippe. The thing was reported to the police, and he was arrested and put in prison. He lived in prison for about 3 or 4 months, condemned for improper acting and for improper words toward the legitimate government. When he came out of his imprisonment, that did not last more than a few months, he engaged again in political action, and he came to quarrel with an opponent that was instead from the opposite side, from the right wing side of French politics of the time. This quarrel ended up with a challenge to a duel. Actually, historians have clarified that the main reason for this fight was more personal than political. In fact, in this couple of months after his release from prison, Galois had engaged in a short love story, the only one of his life, with a young girl who turned out to be absolutely not well behaved. It was sort of prostitute, and the reason why he himself recognized his mistake, but of course he was offended because of that by the guy who challenged him to duel. He probably said very bad words to the address of this young girl of Galois, and with his sense of honor, he had replied in some brush, how to say, rather violent way. And so the are not well appreciated by historians, but the main fact is that there was this provocation to duel that was set in a few days from that day, from the occasion, as it was usual at the time, a very early morning in some secluded place near a church in the outskirts of Paris. And Galois had never used a pistol in his life, never used a gun, was absolutely sure that he would be killed by the other guy who was instead renowned to be a very, how to say, expert user of guns. So the night before the famous duel that has been source even of a film and other legendary artistic there is a drama about Galois' death. I mean, it's very much romantic and obviously was considered by artists. In the night before the duel, he sat down all the night in his little room and rewrote as fast as he could the whole story of his theorem. Produced a manuscript about his ideas and about the proofs of his main theorem, and he and he gave this manuscript to one of his friends, Chevalier, who instead was very much respectful the next day, and it is due to him that we know exactly about Galois' work. The next day, he went to the duel, and as he had foresaw, he was wounded very seriously. He did not die immediately. He was, so to say, helped by some friends who found him already agonizing and brought him to a hospital where he still lived 12 hours and then he expired. Chevalier kept the manuscript of Galois and tried for several years to publish it. Eventually, in 1846, Chevalier, who became by himself a known person, he was an engineer, and at a certain point he was main engineer in the company, the railway company, Chemin de Fer, the main company, railway company of France that railways were developing at the time in the late 40s, beginning of the 50s in France, as in Italy and in other countries. He managed at a certain point to meet Joseph Liouville, the famous mathematician whose theorem you certainly have studied at school in analysis and in mathematical methods for physics, certainly. And Joseph Liouville, who was professor, who had become, was not much younger, neither older than Galois, if Galois had survived. It was more or less of the same generation, but he had not made any duel, so he was alive. He had become, later he had become professor at the École Polytechnique, and even later became a member of the Academy. And in any case, he was the director of what was at the time the main journal, mathematical journal of France, which still existed at the present time, Le Journal de Mathématiques Pures et Appliquées. So he was the main editor of that journal. He got the manuscript of Galois from Chevalier. It was 1846. It took about, well, he probably got it 1 year later, because it took about 1 year for him to study the manuscript, to make a very important introduction to the manuscript, commentaries, and all that. And the manuscript, the original article by Galois, was eventually published in 1846. So 14 years later, after Galois' death. The work of Galois started becoming known because of that publication. And as I told you, was studied first in France. One of the main persons who took the lead in studying Galois' paper and then making his own notes and writing his own paper with an exposition of Galois theory was Camille Jordan, whom I have already mentioned. But there were other people who, in the next decade, in the 50s, studied and worked and made commentaries and even enlarged theory, Galois theory. And among those, there was a Norwegian professor of mathematics, Silov, to whose name some theorems in the theory of groups are attached. And another prominent figure who studied and presented for the Italian public the theory of Galois, but in a very rigorous way and with his own proofs and exercises and examples, is Enrico Betti, main figure of mathematics in the second half of the 19th century. Professor, at the beginning, he was a teacher in Pistoia. He was born in Pistoia, and he was a school teacher in secondary school in Pistoia, but then he became professor of the University of Pisa. And later, but this is a story I tell you a little bit later from now, it became, on one side, after the unification of Italy at the beginning of the 60s, it became even Minister of Education of the newly born Italian kingdom. Then he was made senator. But the main thing is that for about almost 20 years, he was the director of the re-established Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa, which had suffered a similar destiny to the École Normale in Paris. In fact, Scuola Normale di Pisa was founded by Napoleon in Napoleonic times as a sister, as a younger sister of the École Normale Supérieure de Paris, and had survived in the Grand Duchy, in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany for several decades. But in 1848, when was the first so-called first independence war of Italy, and King Charles Albert declared war against Austria in order to gain Milano and Lombardy and many other Italian volunteers from other states of Italy sent volunteers, I mean, other groups of volunteers were created in other states of Italy to fight together with King Albert against the Austrians. The professors, several professors and students from the Scuola Normale di Pisa, together with others, organized a Tuscany, so-called the Legion or regiment, who went to fight against the Austrians in the famous two battles, Curtatone and Montanara. And many of them perished in the battle. and at the time in the main port of Pisa University, there is a monument to remember these patriots, this student and professor patriots that died. But when the King Charles Albert was defeated and Austria prevailed, the Grand Duke of Tuscany was very furious with his own Scuola Normale. Remember that the ruling family in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany was the family of Lorena, so they were cousins of the emperors of Austria. So it was really enraged against the students of Scuola Normale and in general with the students of Pisa. And so he closed the Scuola Normale, and he even tried to abolish the historical University of Pisa that was temporarily transformed into a filial, in a secondary, in a dependance of the University of Siena, just because they were too much liberal. So after the restoration, after the unification of Italy, Betti, who was certainly a patriot, and he had even fought the Austrians in these two famous battles, so he was one of the surviving patriots that had fought at Curtatone and Montanara. He was created the Pisa University was established as an independent university, and the Scuola Normale was reopened, and Enrico Betti became director of the Scuola Normale for a long time, until he was made senator of the Kingdom of Italy. Betti, we will have a lot to tell about him. First of all, certainly if you know a little bit of topology, Betti name is attached to the Betti numbers because he was one of the very first persons to study topology. And the fact that the number of dependent cycles in a variety, homology cycles is called the Betti number is due to Poincaré. But he had originally concerned himself with Galois theory, and then one of the other important merit of Betti is his friendship with Bernard Riemann. And he was the person who, at a later time, just immediately after the reunification of Italy, managed to bring Riemann to Pisa, where Riemann lived for almost 2 years, and he became a good speaker of Italian. There are interesting letters written by Riemann to Betti in Italian, and his Italian is absolutely clean and almost perfect. So the theory of groups started to spread among the scientists, the mathematicians, at the end of the 40s, in the 50s, and in particular in the 60s of the 19th century. So this is as much as I wanted to tell you about Galois. And now we change nation, and we just jump to, I will come back to this. I want to go in historical order. So at this point, we go to the same years, the end of the 40s, the beginning of the 50s, and also later on in England. Because if the theory of groups was very important for physics and mathematics, another very essential item of the modern language in which physics and mathematics are formulated, but not only physics and mathematics, but also applied sciences, and is one of the first topics that you learn when you go to university, if not even you start learning about it in middle school, is so-called the linear algebra, the theory of what we call vector spaces, the theory of vectors and matrices, and so on. And to be honest, I'm pretty sure that you will agree with me if I tell you that from the point of view of, from our contemporary point of view, the concept of vectors is not particularly difficult. And vector spaces are typically something that is absorbed by students at an early age in their career and is rather natural object to study. Matrices appear everywhere, pop up in all sciences, and are also easily digested. But it is extremely interesting, once again, from the point of view of understanding the historical process that led the humans to conceive such abstract concept, to realize that so-called gestation of linear algebra was by no means something quite simple and direct. In fact, it took about 50 years from the middle of the 19th century to the very end of the 19th century to develop clearly the notion of vector spaces and to understand what is a linear map among vector spaces. Although matrices had already been introduced and studied. But it was not immediately clear to the people who gave the first essential and up to the very present moment fundamental contribution to the theory of matrices, it was not clear that they were linear maps. Two figures stand as top figures in the development of linear algebra, and they are both British. They are Arthur Cayley and James Sylvester, whose dates of birth and death you see in these transparencies, together with, on the left, a painting depicting Cayley, and on the right, a photograph even, because he died at enough late time to be the target of cameras. James Sylvester. So the history of these two mathematicians, who were, by the way, close friends, and had many parallels in their life. Is very interesting, not only from the point of view of mathematics, but also from the sociological point of view, and points to the differences between the United Kingdom and continental Europe. Their life is an open testimony of what it meant to be subject of in a kingdom that was becoming the first industrial power of the world, that was becoming the center of one of the largest empire of the world after the Roman Empire, but who had the misfortune of not being conquered by Napoleon, and therefore was plagued by a lot of remnants of feudal society that were not just folklore, had direct consequences on the life of people, as the life of Cayley and Sylvester show very clearly. Let me say that Cayley was one of the most prolific mathematicians of history. He wrote more than 250 or so papers in his life. That was an incredible number for that time. And Sylvester was also very brilliant and very prolific mathematicians. And although, as I told you, they were both very close, they were very close friends, and their life intertwined at times, they never wrote a paper together. But they had high respect for each other and good friendship. Now, Cayley graduated from Cambridge, and the same did Sylvester. They had a stop in their academic career. They graduated in mathematics in Cambridge. Well, Cayley graduated in mathematics from Cambridge. Sylvester not even graduated for the reason I'm going to tell you. Apparently, Cayley was half Russian in the sense that his mother is reputed to be Russian. He was from a well-to-do family of merchants, of British merchants who had established a sort of filial, a secondary point of selling. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but in any case, they had magazine and at a shop and some correspondent secondary site in St. Petersburg. And Cayley's father apparently knew his future wife in St. Petersburg. She was probably a well-to-do Russian, and he married. And later, they closed their site in St. Petersburg, and when Cayley was very, very young, made a return to London, where Cayley grew up, studied, and made all of his life. So he studied in Cambridge, and he was a very brilliant student. And he graduated and wanted to continue in some way the academic career. But judged from this, he was born in 1821, so he probably graduated in Cambridge something around 1840 something, early 40s. Now, in early 40s, Britain was already in the most advanced industrial development. Britain was in the most advanced industrial development. It was, from many viewpoints, the richest and most important modern economy of Europe. But nevertheless, in the historical University of Cambridge, in order to become something like postdoc or something like that and continue an academic career, you had to become a priest. He had to take the orders, the minor orders of the Church of England. Otherwise, he could not continue his study. Cayley was a good believer. He was declared himself a Christian all of his life. He was he respected the Church of England. He had no problem about that, but he had no inclination to become a priest. He wanted to be a mathematician and a scientist, and he wanted to have a normal family. So he had to stop his academic career in Cambridge. And you know what he did? He turned to a law school, and at the Lincoln's Inn of London, the famous inns in the city of London that are law schools, he enrolled, became a lawyer, and opened his own business as a lawyer. For 14 years, he made his life being a lawyer, also a very good one. But while he was practicing the profession of a lawyer, he was at the same time privately, as a hobby, pursuing his activity as a mathematician. And in fact, he published an enormous number of papers on the proceedings of the Royal Academy of Sciences of England. 14 years he was a lawyer. James Sylvester had a similar destiny. He was slightly senior. He was about 7 years older than his friend. And he also made a very nice career as a student in Cambridge. But he was stopped even at an earlier time. He was not given his diploma. And the reason in this case was that not only he was not inclined to become a priest, but he had an even more serious problem. He was not a Christian. He was a Jew. And he refused to renounce his own, although he was never a practicant. I mean, he was not really practicing the Jewish religion, but he had no inclination in refusing his own religion, and in particular in signing up the 39 Articles of the Church of England. So because of that, he was not admitted to sustain the final examination and to get a diploma from Cambridge. So he also made something similar to Cayley. Instead of becoming a lawyer, he made also sort of juridical studies, but more oriented in a slightly different direction. And he became a clerk and then a manager of an insurance company. At that time in Britain, the first insurance company in the modern sense developed, and he became an insurance clerk, company clerk. But also at the same level as Cayley, he continued his mathematical studies and published several papers. Later on, Cayley emigrated to the United States, where he was, without laurea, he was a professor in the University of Virginia for a few years. And then he came back to England, and finally in England, they found a place for him as professor of mathematics in the Warwick School. This is a military school in London for artillery. And so he was for many years a professor of mathematics in this artillery school, and frequently visited Cayley, who was instead practicing his profession as a lawyer at the Lincoln Inns Court. Later, at a certain point, he was eventually offered a chair in Cambridge, and he became finally, at the age of 40-something, professor of mathematics of the University of Cambridge, where he was on that chair. He sat all of his remaining part of life, and the normal academic existence in Cambridge. Sylvester, on the opposite, when at a certain point went back again to the United States, was once again a professor in this time in Baltimore, in Maryland, at the Johns Hopkins University, and came back to England only when he was already on retirement. And at that point, the University of Cambridge, with a sort of shameful, feeling the shame of all what had happened many years before, gave him the postponed graduation in mathematics. Then a very honorific new chair, the Sadler Chair of Geometry, was created at the University of Oxford, especially for Sylvester, who became professor of geometry at the University of Oxford. I can show you next picture. The Savilian professors of geometry, that chair had continued to exist after Sylvester's death, and one of the last already on retirement occupant of this chair, one of the famous people who sat on this chair, is Hitchin, very famous contemporary mathematician already on retirement, who had been the best student, and he was in some sense the successor of Lord Atiyah, Sir Michael Atiyah, one of the main figure of modern mathematics in the last part of the 19th century. And just for you to know, one of the main, most famous recent means of the last few decades theorem is Atiyah index theorem. And Lord Atiyah, Lord Michael Atiyah, is not even English. He is originally from Lebanon. He is of Arabic origin, Sir Michael Atiyah. He was teacher of Hitchin, and Hitchin has been a very prominent mathematician. There are Hitchin spaces and many things. All that dates back to the Savilian chair that was created for Sylvester. So Sylvester and Cayley were at a certain time nicknamed by people. You know that the English people are famous for finding nicknames, they were named the invariant twins, because both of them were very much concerned with the theory of invariance and with the theory of matrices. So after I told you a little bit about their lives, let me talk about their work. One of the most important papers of Cayley dates back to 1859, and it's called a memoir on the theory of matrices. Here you can see some, this is just for folklore. These formulae are copied directly from the original paper. And you see what is the strange notation that he used for matrices. He used not the normal brackets, but these brackets with this sort of hook at the top. And I clarified to myself, but I'm not sure that this was really the origin of the notation, is that if you describe what nowadays we mean by applying a matrix to a vector, here is 3 by 3 matrices, you obtain a new vector, of course, but this is the multiplication. And if you write vectors in normal brackets by mentioning their components, x, y, z, then if you put the matrix close to such a vector, a little bit closer than usual, you see this intersection of the brackets, which resembles the symbol for product, x. So my opinion on why Cayley introduced such a strange notation is because it mimicked an x for product, so that you clearly understand what is the product of a matrix with a vector. But it is very interesting to say that what is the definition that Cayley, in his paper of 1859, gives of a matrix. He simply says that it is an array of numbers. It does not identify the matrix with an operator acting on a space, a vector space. This was still to come. For him, a matrix was simply an array of numbers. Nevertheless, it was clear for him that a matrix might act on a triplet or a fortuplet or whatever of numbers, producing a new set of numbers. So actually, the explicit representation of the action of a matrix as an operator on vectors. But it was not conscious that these numbers formed a space. It was something for them, for the people of this decade, they were just arrays of numbers and certain operation on arrays of numbers. But why is the 1859 paper of Cayley so important? Because it is the paper where for the first time appears what later was called the Cayley-Hamilton theorem, named the secular equation for eigenvalues. It is in this paper that Cayley proved that if a matrix applied to a vector yields as a result a new vector that is proportional to the old one by what we nowadays call an eigenvalue, then this eigenvalue, this number lambda, has to be a root of the equation 0 equal determinant of m minus lambda 1. And it is also very curious to read the statement that Cayley wrote. He said, I have verified the theorem in the next simplest case, that of a matrix of order 3. He had proven it for matrices of order 2. Then he had verified the statement for matrices of order 3. But I have not thought it necessary to undertake the labor of a formal proof of the theorem in the general case of a matrix of any degree. Here you see at work that there is a style, a way of doing things different in the mathematics of different people. If Cayley had been a French, he would have undertaken the burden of making a formal proof. But as a pragmatic British person, he had proven it for 2 and 3 and said, well, then it will be true for any value of n, for any dimension. It is very typical and very British. Pragmatic people, not formal like the French and the Germans. Nevertheless, the theorem is very important. You all know how important it is. And it is even more interesting to learn who was the referee of this paper, because some historian of mathematics, certain Crelling, has discovered in his historical researches the original referee report at the Academy of Sciences, Royal Academy, the original referee report, and who was the author. The author was no one less than George Boole, the founder of modern symbolic logic, another gigantic figure in British mathematics, whose life was no less signed, was also signed by a lot of difficulties, because he was born very poor, and he was the son of a shoemaker, and his education was simply given to him by the local parish priest, who taught him some Latin and some other few things. But he was very brilliant. And later he made himself a living by giving private lessons and organizing a board school. These private schools where the children live in the school. He was never a professor in any university, but nevertheless, his name is renowned up to the present time because we talk about Boolean algebras and so on. He was the founder of the symbolic logic. The symbols belonging to, member of, union of sets, intersection of sets, and all of that is due to George Boole, who died in 1864 from pneumonia because he was relevantly very young. He was only 51 of age, as you can see. But in these last years, he had succeeded in obtaining a position in Ireland, that at the time was part of the United Kingdom, in Dublin. He was essentially a sort of president of this school. And he was one day going to school for his daily job, but there was a storm, In Ireland, as you know, it rains almost every day. And so he was without an umbrella under the rain, and nevertheless, he was conscious and very, respectful of all the rules. Wanted to go to the school, nevertheless, notwithstanding the heavy rain and his being deprived of an umbrella. He went, made his work, but he got some flu from that, got a cold, essentially, which became a flu and later degenerated into a pneumonia, and he died. Now, it is very much interesting that this genius, George Boole, was for the Royal Society, not Academy, sorry, I told you all the time Royal Academy, but I should say Royal Society, proceeding of the Royal Society. That he was the referee of Cayley's paper. And this referee, as I told you, survived, and it is interesting to read what he said that, let me see where it is. He said in his referee report that that the paper of Cayley, I was looking whether I've reported this extract from his referee report, but I tell you in words. He said that the paper was very interesting and very clear, and what Cayley had done might be understood as a part of what he called the calculus of operations. He was the inventor, George Boole, of this notion of calculus of operations. Nowadays, we would refer to operation as operators, and in fact, a matrix is an operator. You learned this in your course of mechanics, and so he was seeing beyond Cayley. He was saying that the matrices are operators, and the fact that Cayley introduced the notion of summing matrices, multiplying matrices among themselves, and doing even dividing matrices one by another, namely calculating the inverse. That was part of an algebra, we would say, that in his language, older styled language, because it was just the beginning of all that, George Boole called the calculus of operations. And so the algebra of operators was starting being something understood, vaguely understood, at the end of the 50s of the 19th century. And in fact, in another paper by Cayley, taking the suggestions that came, I found. Here is the precise text of Boole, and it is interesting to read. He says, this memoir is an application of what has recently been termed calculus of operation to a particular branch of the calculus of functions. A matrix is a complex symbol denoting an operation by which from any set of quantities, x, y, and z, we form a set of linear functions of these quantities. Of course, each line multiplied gives a new linear function. The number of such functions being the class of matrices chiefly considered by author, equal to the number of the subject quantities. So he's telling us that Cayley considered square matrices. But George Boole was going on that and was implying that there might be also rectangular matrices. As operations such as the above may be performed in succession, as the results to which they led are capable of addition and subtraction, as also here as elsewhere, a direct operation supposes the existence of a corresponding inverse operation. This inquiry is suggested what are the distinctive laws of this class of operation and to what special forms of calculus, included under the more general calculus of operation, they give birth. This inquiry forms the business of the memoir, and its results are developed with clearness and ability. In certain general features they resemble, and necessarily so, the results of all other special developments of the calculus of operation, and they are certainly of an interesting character. As you see, George Boole is very clear, and he sees what is implicit in Cayley's paper, but Cayley has not made openly conscious, namely that matrices are the representation of an abstract operator among vector spaces. The problem in this is that the notion of vector spaces was completely missing. Although this is strange because there had been someone who thought about them, and I will tell you in a moment, was a German, Grassmann. But let's see another paper by Cayley of 1854. That was the paper where, in the same vein, Cayley tried to formalize the concept of group. Groups had appeared, as I told you, and we have discussed at length, in Galois' theory. But although Galois was ahead of everyone in his abstract thinking, his groups were still only the groups of substitutions. He had done this miraculous extrapolation that from substitutions of the roots, he obtained the action of the group on what he called the extended field, the new field of numbers obtained by extension with the addition of the roots of the equation. We said for the simplest extension of the rational numbers is the field obtained by extending it with the square root of 2. So in his paper of 1854, when he was still a lawyer, you should remember that he was still a lawyer. He was not yet professor in Cambridge, but he was concerned with such questions. He tried to formalize the idea of what is a group. And essentially, it came very close to our present day notion by saying that it is an operation on something, and it did not quantify how many these somethings are. Introduce the inverse and the multiplication of these operations. But actually, his definition from a clear modern viewpoint is wrong, because he missed the main thing. He was using one, the symbol 1 as number 1, essentially to mean the neutral element, the map that doesn't do anything. but he forgot to introduce the axiom that the number one should be unique. He was pretending that for each operation there exists inverse operation. That is okay. So in principle, x times x minus 1 makes the identity map. But it is essential from the logical point of view. You can easily show that if you do not assume the action that the identity is unique, there is only one neutral element, you run into logical problems and there is an inconsistency in the definition. So he almost came to the correct definition of what is a group. Still, he missed one point. In fact, if we want to translate into Boolean language what he said these three actions, that for every A and B belonging to the group G, A times B belongs to G. We agree with that. And then he said that for any A and B, there exists a B1, a B prime, such that A times B prime is equal to B. And thirdly, he said that for A and B, there is another B prime, such that B prime times A is equal to B. So essentially, he introduced the inverse operation. But if you only say that, you say something that is true for a group, but it is not enough, because now in this moment I cannot remember how you can manipulate the actions and come to a contradiction that is no longer a contradiction unless you assume that there is the neutral element such that A times E is equal to E times A is equal to A. And the properties 2 and 3 advocated by Cayley, we can show are not sufficient. You are not able from these two properties to deduce in a unique way that there exists the identity element. So as actions, they are incorrect. So let's come now to see that is one example how difficult it was to introduce the notion, an abstract notion of group, even if groups were already known as group of substitution, even if they were used as they were used by Galois, but the axiomatic formulation was not easy to find. Even such a genius as Cayley, one of the most prominent mathematicians of all ages, was not able to give a right answer to the problem. He missed something. And he had not even understood, as George Boole did instead in his report, the abstract meaning of a matrix. That is a representation of an operator in a basis, because it was missing the notion of vector spaces. So let's come to another sort of unrecognized genius, that is Grassmann, Hermann Gunther Grassmann. He was born in Stettin, that nowadays is part of Poland, but at the time was part of East Prussia, and died in the same Stettin in 1877. As early 1844, he published at his own expenses. He was a school teacher. He was professor of mathematics in his town in a lyceum. He almost never moved from Stettin. He had published at his own expenses absolutely outstanding and surprising book entitled Die lineale Ausdehnungslehre, ein neuer Zweig der Mathematik, which translated from the German means La scienza lineare, una nuova branca della matematica. This book is absolutely surprising because it contains essentially all the definitions of what we call nowadays a linear space. He introduced the notion of linear combination of a certain abstract that now we would call a basis of vectors. So E1, E2, E3, whatever. He defined the linear combination of these abstract objects that create a basis. Then he defined the operation of summing of this linear combination, multiplication by what we would call a scalar, and so on and so forth. Essentially, with very few unprecisions, but very, very few and marginal, he developed for the first time the abstract notion of what is a linear space, named vector space. But the strange story is that he published this book at his own expenses. He sent his book to the most famous mathematicians of the time, including Kummer, Dedekind, and others throughout Germany. And no one paid attention to his book. And even people of the quality, I think it was Kummer, said that this was just blah blah about non-existing things, that it was a sort of manipulator of trivialities or of non-existing things, and essentially it was completely discarded. He tried a second edition later of the same Ausdehnungslehre, lineale Ausdehnung. The reception of his second edition, about 15 or several years later, I should say, was the same. No one in 19th century mathematics up to Grassmann's death paid any attention to his theory of linear spaces. So it is really surprising that such a basic notion, the notion of vector and the space of vectors, that in a way was known since the time of Newton, that was implicitly utilized in many instances, was not recognized as an important, essential item from the abstract viewpoint. And that made the theory of matrices, the theory of groups, and so on and so forth, difficult. Because one essential item that was present but had to be axiomatized, had to be received as an abstract notion, was not received by such distinguished and important mathematicians as they were available and active in the middle of the 19th century and even in the third quarter of the 19th century. Finally, the theory of linear spaces took its final shape thanks to Torino and to our distinguished and absolutely class mathematician, Giuseppe Peano. Here you see the book that was published in Torino in 1888 by Giuseppe Peano, that is called Calcolo Geometrico secondo l'Ausdehnungslehre di Grassmann, preceduto dalle operazioni della logica deduttiva. So it was Peano who really studied after Grassmann's death, Grassmann's book, received completely its message, received at the same time the message of abstract logic introduced almost 30 years before by George Boole, and made mathematics receive this basic notion that was systematizing all previous assessments in group theory, in geometry, and in many other aspects, and in physics as well. It is interesting, coming back to Grassmann, to tell you what was the destiny of Grassmann. Since Grassmann was not heard and was not, no one listened to him in the world of mathematics, he finally changed field. He became a linguist. And in this second profession, instead, he is well remembered by linguists. And there is a certain law in linguistics that is called the Grassmann law. And I'm not sure that all linguists know that their Grassmann is the same Grassmann of mathematics. In linguistics, he had better fortune, and he is still remembered, and Grassmann law is still taught in the courses, in the academic courses on comparative Indo-European linguistics. It's something to do with the law, Grassmann law has something to do with a typical phenomenon in linguistic, in Indo-European or Indo-Germanic languages, that when there are two aspirations in the same word, so like two consonants with an aspiration, one of the two aspirations is deleted. And that is present in Greek, in Sanskrit, and almost all other Indo-European languages. That was a discovery of Grassmann. So the next topic I will address is a short history of differential geometry from Gauss to Levi-Civita. But since it is now 5 minutes to 6, I think that for today we might stop here. And I am open to questions if there are any. Do you have questions? Sorry, I can hear you not too well. Can you raise?
That I don't have any questions. I've just found really interesting the part of Galois.
Of Galois, yes, yes. It is romantic. Eh?
Yeah, in a way, I think, yes, it is.
Yes. As I told the other students, I have recently written a book about all these stories I'm telling you in an academic way, but all the material and human histories I'm telling you are the topics in a book written in Italian that I'm now trying to publish. I have a few candidate um, editors, sorry, publishers, and so it's not yet published. But certainly I will remember what you told me, and I will send you a copy of the book as soon as it is published, so you can read the story of Galois in full details.
Okay. Thank you, and congratulations.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, no other questions from the other listeners? Apparently not. So, I wish you nice evening, and we meet once again on Wednesday, right?
Yeah, perfect.
That's
Okay.
right.
Okay. Have a nice
Okay,
evening to all
Yeah,
of
for
you.
you
nice
too.
evening.
See you on
Grazie
Wednesday.
mille.
Grazie.
Buon pomeriggio.
Buon pomeriggio. Buon
Arrivederci,
pomeriggio,
buon
buonasera.
pomeriggio.
Benissimo. Arrivederci.
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 Arrivederci.